The moment Thomas Reed muted the television and told Eleanor Whitmore to leave the room, something invisible but irreversible shifted inside the house on Marigold Street. The click of the remote was soft, almost polite, but the silence that followed felt like a door slamming in a cathedral. Eleanor had been sitting in her usual armchair by the bay window, the late afternoon light settling gently across her silver hair, the news murmuring in the background more as company than entertainment. That half hour every evening had become her ritual, a quiet reclaiming of space in a home she had purchased 42 years earlier with her late husband. It was never about headlines. It was about presence, about stillness, about remembering that she existed beyond requests, beyond tension, beyond the careful choreography required to avoid conflict. Thomas did not look at her when he stepped in front of a screen. He was younger by 3 decades, broad-shouldered, always slightly restless, as if the air inside the house did not quite satisfy him. He pressed the mute button first, then powered the television off entirely, reducing the room to a black reflection of its occupants. Only then did he turn. "You've had it long enough," he said, voice flat but firm. "Go upstairs. We're using the living room." Eleanor blinked once, steady and slow. For a fleeting second, she wondered if she had misunderstood him. At 71, she had learned that cruelty sometimes hides behind casual tone, and sometimes people retreat from their own sharpness if given a chance. She glanced toward the kitchen archway where her daughter, Melissa, stood frozen beside the counter, a dish towel clenched between her fingers. Their eyes met. Eleanor waited for something, one sentence, one objection, even a mild protest. "Mom's watching that." Or, "Let's share." Anything that would acknowledge what had just occurred. Melissa lowered her gaze. That was the exact instant Eleanor stopped shrinking. Thomas dropped onto the leather sectional Eleanor had paid for in cash, stretching his legs across the coffee table as though claiming conquered territory. He turned up the volume on his phone, laughter from some videos spilling into the quiet. In his posture there was assumption, and in that assumption was something worse than rudeness. It was erasure. Eleanor stood slowly, joints stiff but deliberate, and smoothed the front of her cardigan. She walked to the hallway table where a ceramic bowl held loose keys and unopened mail. Her fingers closed around her car keys. The metal felt grounding, cool and unyielding. Behind her, Thomas let out a short, dismissive chuckle. "Don't forget your purse," he added, as if offering helpful advice. Melissa did not move. Eleanor paused only once, long enough to look at the framed landscape hanging slightly crooked on the wall, a watercolor of coastal cliffs she had bought during a trip with her husband decades ago. She had dusted that frame every Sunday morning for years. She had replaced the rug beneath the coffee table twice. She had repainted the walls herself when Melissa insisted the color felt dated. And over the past 3 years, since Melissa and Thomas had temporarily moved in after a failed business venture, Eleanor had gradually reduced her presence in room after room, telling herself that flexibility was kindness and kindness was strength. She stepped outside without raising her voice. She closed the front door gently, not in surrender and not in fury, but with finality. The autumn air carried the scent of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke. She locked the door from the outside, an action Thomas likely did not even notice, and walked down the sidewalk until she reached the main road, where she called a car service. When the driver asked for a destination, she gave the name of a small inn near the riverfront district. As the car pulled away, her hands trembled, but not from fear. They trembled from awakening. That evening, seated alone in a modest but immaculate room overlooking the water, Eleanor opened a slim metal briefcase she had not touched in years. Inside were copies of property records, tax receipts, and a deed bearing her name alone. After her husband's passing, she had refused every suggestion to add Melissa to the title. There's time for that later, she had always said. Later had never come. The deed remained unchanged. Sole owner, Eleanor Whitmore. She allowed herself a small, measured smile. For 35 years, she had worked at the Municipal Property Registry downtown. She had watched families fracture over boundary lines and inheritance misunderstandings. She had seen siblings become strangers because someone assumed access meant ownership. Through it all, she had learned that sentiment fades under scrutiny, but documentation does not. Paper does not raise its voice. It simply stands. She reached for her phone and scrolled to a contact she had not dialed in nearly a decade. Martin Caldwell, a real estate attorney whose office had once been across from hers. Their professional interactions had been sparse but efficient, built on mutual respect and an understanding of procedure. He answered on the second ring, voice cautious but warm. "Eleanor? It's late. Is everything all right?" "It will be," she replied calmly. "I need guidance." She outlined the situation without embellishment. Her daughter and son-in-law had been living in her home without a lease for 3 years. Utilities remained in her name. No rent had ever been paid. Tonight, she had been asked to vacate her own living room. There was a pause on the other end, not shock but calculation. "Is the property still solely in your name?" Martin asked. "Yes." "Then this isn't complicated," he said. "They are occupants by permission. Permission can be withdrawn. We'll issue formal notice. No confrontation required, just procedure." "Tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he confirmed. "I'll have someone deliver it. You don't need to be present." After ending the call, Eleanor stood at the window watching reflections ripple across the dark river. She did not cry. She did not rage. She slept deeply, as if her body recognized that a decision long delayed had finally been made. Morning arrived crisp and pale. At 8:15 a.m., her phone vibrated. "Notice will be served at 9, Martin texted. At 9:23, Melissa's name flashed across her screen. Eleanor let it ring twice before answering. Her daughter's voice was thin and strained. "Mom, there's someone at the door with paperwork. Thomas is furious." "What is this?" "It is clarification," Eleanor replied evenly. "Read it." Muffled shouting erupted in the background, Thomas demanding explanations, calling the situation absurd. Then silence broken by the sound of paper unfolding. "Notice of termination of occupancy," Melissa whispered. 30 days. "Yes." "You can't just do that." "I can," Eleanor said. "It is my house." The line went quiet again. She could almost hear the shift as realization began pressing against denial. When the call ended abruptly, Eleanor set the phone down and poured herself coffee in the hotel lobby cafe. She did not check her messages again until she had finished the cup. By midday, another alert appeared. A declined transaction from the grocery store. She had already contacted the bank to remove Melissa's supplementary card and suspend shared access to her primary account. Assistance had become assumption. Assumption had become entitlement. That chain was now broken. When Thomas called, his voice was loud enough to distort through the speaker. "You're humiliating us," he accused. "Do you know how this looks?" "Humiliation," Eleanor replied calmly, "is being dismissed in your own home. What you're experiencing is inconvenience." He attempted explanations. Investments pending, contracts delayed, opportunities around the corner. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she asked one simple question. "Where is the money, Thomas?" Silence answered first. That silence told her everything. By late afternoon, Martin sent another message. "Expect resistance. Stay steady." Eleanor stood once more by the window, overlooking the river. She felt no triumph, only steadiness. The house on Marigold Street was still hers. The walls, the floors, The quiet evenings she had surrendered inch by inch, all legally intact. Thomas had mistaken tolerance for weakness. Melissa had mistaken silence for peace. Both were about to learn the difference. The river below moved forward without hesitation, indifferent to human drama. Eleanor watched it flow and understood something with crystal clarity. Reclaiming space was not cruelty. It was correction. The first step had been taken, and it had been quieter than anyone expected. The legal meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Martin Caldwell's office on Ashbury Avenue. The building itself was unremarkable, 3 floors of brick and glass wedged between a dental clinic and a travel agency, but inside, everything was deliberate. Clean lines, neutral walls, a conference table large enough to separate emotion from fact. Eleanor arrived early. She chose the chair at the far end of the table, not for dominance, but for clarity. From that seat she could see the door, the hallway beyond it, and the faces of anyone who entered. She placed 3 items in front of her: her identification, a certified copy of the deed, and the notice of termination. Nothing else.
No dramatics. No accusations.
Martin sat to her right, flipping through a slim folder, posture relaxed but attentive. You don't need to speak unless you want to, he reminded her quietly. The documents will do most of the work.
I'm aware, Eleanor replied.
At exactly 10:02 a.m., the door opened. Thomas entered first. He looked different from the man who had sprawled across her couch days earlier. His movements were sharp, slightly uncoordinated. His shirt was wrinkled, collar askew, as if sleep had evaded him. His jaw was tight, but there was something new behind the anger, uncertainty. Melissa followed, slower. She held her purse with both hands pressed against her stomach, like armor. Her eyes met Eleanor's briefly, before flickering away. Let's begin, Martin said evenly. Thomas didn't sit immediately. This is unnecessary, he started. We've lived in that house for 3 years. We've established residency. You can't just toss us out because of a disagreement. It wasn't a disagreement, Eleanor said calmly. He ignored her. There are rights. There are protections. I've read about adverse possession. Martin folded his hands. Adverse possession requires continuous occupation without the owner's presence or consent. Mrs. Whitmore has lived in the property the entire time. She paid all expenses. The claim doesn't apply. Thomas scoffed, finally dropping into a chair. We improved that house. We maintained it. You occupied it, Eleanor corrected quietly. Maintenance of what you use is not ownership. Melissa's fingers tightened around her purse strap. Mom, we thought this was temporary, she said softly. You said we could stay. I did, Eleanor replied. And I meant it. Temporary does not become permanent simply because no one questions it. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on the table. You cut off the card. You shut down the utilities. You're trying to force us out financially. I stopped financing you, Eleanor said. There's a difference. He laughed under his breath, brittle. You're overreacting. Martin slid a document across the table. The notice gives you 30 days. No fees have been requested. No damages claimed at this time. It is lawful and generous. Generous? Thomas snapped. Eleanor opened her folder. From inside, she removed several printed statements, bank summaries, credit reports, and public records Martin had helped her retrieve. She placed them on the table, aligning the corners carefully. Melissa hesitated before picking them up. At first, her eyes moved quickly across the pages. Then slower. Then she stopped. What is this? She whispered. Your joint credit line, Eleanor answered. Closed yesterday. Outstanding balances listed there. And that brokerage account Thomas mentioned. Those are the losses. Thomas stiffened. You had no right to look into that. I had every right. Eleanor replied. My name was connected to the funding source. Melissa's breathing changed. You said we were saving, she murmured to Thomas. It was a market dip, he said quickly. Temporary. The dip has lasted 3 years? Eleanor asked. Silence. The room felt colder. Martin leaned back slightly. This meeting is not about investment strategy. It is about occupancy.
The deadline stands.
You are expected to vacate by the 30th at 11 a.m. A walkthrough will occur that afternoon. Thomas's composure cracked. You're doing this to punish me, he said, turning toward Eleanor. You never liked me. Eleanor held his gaze evenly. This is not about liking you. It is about being told to leave my own living room. Melissa flinched. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. Family helps family. Family does not erase its elders, Eleanor said. Family does not silence the person who owns the roof overhead. Melissa looked between them, torn, exhausted. We didn't mean for it to go this far. It went this far because no one corrected it sooner, Eleanor said. Thomas stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. You'll regret this. Martin's voice stayed calm. Threats will be documented. Thomas's jaw worked, but he said nothing more. The meeting ended without handshake or reconciliation. Eleanor rose steadily, gathering her papers with measured precision. As she passed Thomas, she paused just long enough to speak in a tone only he could hear. You mistook my patience for dependence. He didn't answer. Outside, the air felt brighter than it had in days. By afternoon, consequences began rippling outward. Thomas, in a moment of reckless frustration, had sent a series of emails from his work account complaining about family interference and financial sabotage, copying supervisors and colleagues. His employer did not respond with sympathy. They responded with concern. Within hours, he was asked to step away pending review. Melissa called Eleanor that evening from a park bench 2 neighborhoods away. I didn't go home, she said quietly. Eleanor waited. He was yelling in the parking lot, saying you ruined everything, saying I should choose sides. And, Eleanor asked. I walked. There was wind in the background, traffic, distant voices. I don't know what to do, Melissa admitted. You know how to work, Eleanor replied gently. You know how to live without someone managing your decisions. Start there. Melissa was quiet for a long time. If I leave him, will you still? I will always be your mother, Eleanor said. But I will not protect you from consequences that are not mine. That night, Melissa stayed with a coworker. The next morning, she opened a new checking account in her own name. She updated her direct deposit. She contacted a small apartment complex near her office and scheduled a viewing. The unit was modest, a studio with pale carpet and a narrow balcony, but it was available immediately. 3 days later, she signed a 6-month lease. When she called Eleanor to tell her, her voice sounded steadier. I keep thinking, she said, if you had just turned the card back on, I would have apologized. I would have told you he didn't mean it. I would still be there. I know, Eleanor answered. That's what scares me. It should, Eleanor said gently. Thomas, meanwhile, oscillated between outrage and desperation. He called repeatedly, texted accusations, sent long messages about betrayal. Eleanor did not respond. Silence had transformed from weakness into boundary. On the 10th day after the notice, he attempted to negotiate. Give us 6 months, he demanded, just until I stabilize things. 30 days, Eleanor replied once in writing. No further explanation. By the 3rd week, his tone shifted again, less anger, more urgency. We need time, he insisted. There's nowhere to go. There are apartments, Eleanor responded.
There are jobs.
There are options. You're heartless. No, she wrote back. I'm finished. Melissa stopped taking his calls entirely after he accused her of abandoning him under pressure. She filed paperwork for legal separation before the eviction deadline arrived. Each day that passed made something clearer. The house was not the only structure being reclaimed. Identity was. On the 29th day, Martin confirmed that a moving truck had been reserved. Thomas had secured a short-term rental across town. No apology had been issued. No ownership had been admitted. But the departure was scheduled. Eleanor spent that evening at the river again, watching reflections shimmer against dark water. She felt neither triumph nor grief. Only alignment. The house on Marigold Street had not changed, but the people inside it had. And by the time the 30th morning arrived, there would be no confusion left about who belonged there and under what terms. Day 30 arrived without thunder, without confrontation, without spectacle. It came quietly, like every other morning, but Eleanor Whitmore woke with a steadiness she had not felt in years. There was no anxiety pressing against her ribs, no anticipation of raised voices echoing down the hallway. There was simply clarity. She did not return to Marigold Street immediately. Martin had advised against it. Let procedure complete itself, he had said. You don't need to witness the exit. Let the house empty before you walk back in. So Eleanor drove east instead, away from the familiar neighborhoods and into open countryside where late autumn fields stretched wide under a pale sky. She stopped at a roadside cafe she used to visit with her husband years ago during Sunday drives. The building had been renovated, but the windows still caught the morning light the same way. She ordered eggs, toast, and black coffee and chose a table facing the horizon. At 9:18 a.m., her phone buzzed. They're loading boxes. No resistance. She finished her coffee before checking again. At 10:02. Truck nearly full. Minor cosmetic wall damage noted. No structural issues. At 10:47. Keys collected. Property vacated. That was it. No dramatic final call. No last attempt at negotiation. Just departure reduced to logistics. Eleanor sat for a long moment after reading the final message. She did not smile.
She did not sigh.
She simply let the stillness expand inside her. 3 years of tension had ended not with shouting, but with paperwork and a truck pulling away. She drove back to the city in the early afternoon. When she turned onto Marigold Street, the house looked smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps lighter. The moving truck was gone. The driveway empty. Curtains still drawn. She parked slowly. The key slid into the lock without resistance. When she turned it, there was no echo of argument, no television blaring behind the door. Only quiet. The air inside felt stale, heavy with what had been said in that space over the past few years. Eleanor stepped in and closed the door behind her. She stood still for a full minute, listening. Nothing.
No footsteps overhead.
No phone videos playing at full volume. No sharp laughter from the couch. The living room was stripped of Thomas's presence. The sectional remained. He hadn't owned it, but his oversized chair was gone. The coffee table had scratches she didn't remember. Pale rectangles marked where electronics once hung from the wall. A cable cord dangled loosely from an outlet. She walked slowly through each room. The kitchen counters were clear but sticky in places. Cabinet doors slightly misaligned. The guest bedroom, once her late husband's study, had nail holes scattered across one wall. In the hallway, scuff marks traced where furniture had been dragged rather than lifted. None of it was catastrophic, but each mark told a story of assumption. Eleanor opened every window in the house. Cool air rushed in, lifting curtains, shifting dust motes into sunlight. It felt like the house exhaled. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and filled a bucket with warm water and cleaner. There is something grounding about physical work after emotional upheaval. Scrubbing requires no debate. It demands presence. She began with the baseboards in the living room. Kneeling carefully, she wiped away accumulated grime inch by inch. The repetitive motion steadied her thoughts. Not anger, not resentment, just reclamation. By evening, the floors were washed. Trash bags lined the curb, broken appliances, half-used bottles of products Thomas insisted were essential, outdated gadgets left behind. She worked until her back protested and her hands smelled of soap. The next morning, a painter arrived. He walked through the house with a small notebook, nodding at the walls. Same color, he asked. Eleanor paused in the center of the living room. For 3 years, she had adjusted to Thomas's preferences, neutral gray, minimalist tones, modern updates. The house had slowly shifted away from her warmth into something impersonal. No, she said. I'd like something warmer. They stood before a palette of samples. Her finger hovered, then stopped. Soft apricot. Subtle but alive. Let's try this. By late afternoon, the walls glowed gently in the new shade. The room felt transformed, not dramatically, but undeniably. The colors softened the light. It belonged to her. She repositioned her armchair by the bay window. She placed a small wooden table beside it and set her favorite ceramic lamp on top. When she brewed tea that evening, the kettle's whistle echoed pleasantly through an empty house without interruption. She sat down and picked up the television remote. For a moment, she held it in her palm, turning it over thoughtfully. Such a small object. So much symbolic weight. She turned the television on, adjusted the volume to her liking, then lowered it slightly. Enough. A gentle knock came at the door just as dusk settled. Eleanor already knew who it would be. Melissa stood on the porch, hands folded loosely in front of her. She looked thinner, tired, but clearer somehow. No frantic energy behind her eyes.
No defensiveness.
May I come in? She asked. Eleanor studied her daughter's face carefully before stepping aside. You may. Melissa entered slowly, gaze moving across the freshly painted walls, the open windows, the absence of clutter. She exhaled, almost unconsciously. It feels a lighter, she said. It is, Eleanor replied. They sat at the dining table, mugs of tea between them. No accusations hung in the air.
No rehearsed speeches.
Just quiet acknowledgement. I signed the final separation papers, Melissa said after a while. Eleanor nodded once. He keeps saying you destroyed everything. I ended something, Eleanor said calmly. There's a difference. Melissa traced the rim of her mug with her finger. I didn't see how bad it had become. You weren't meant to, Eleanor replied gently. Dependency hides itself behind promises. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective. My apartment is small, Melissa said. The walls are thin. I can't hear my neighbor's dog at night. Do you feel safe? Eleanor asked. Yes. Then it's big enough. Melissa smiled faintly. They did not discuss money. Melissa did not ask for help. That absence spoke louder than any apology. When she left later that evening, she did not ask for a key, and Eleanor did not offer one. Over the following weeks, the house regained rhythm. Morning light moved slowly across the apricot walls. Eleanor resumed her routine, coffee at 7, a short walk through the neighborhood at 8, reading by the window in the afternoon. The television volume remained exactly where she set it. No one reached past her to change it. On Wednesdays, she began hosting small afternoon gatherings. Nothing formal, just tea, pie, and conversation. Neighbors came hesitantly at first, then regularly. Conversations drifted toward shared concerns, children wanting access to deeds, financial, temporary arrangements, blurred lines between support and surrender. Eleanor listened carefully before speaking. Ownership, she would say gently, is not unkind. Boundaries are not betrayal. You can love someone and still require respect. Pens often came out during those afternoons. Notes were taken. Questions asked. The house, once a site of tension, had become a place of clarity. One evening, after her guests left and dishes were washed, Eleanor stood alone in the living room. The lamp cast a soft circle of light over her chair. Outside, the street was calm. For the first time in years, the house did not feel like something she was defending. It felt like something she inhabited. She walked to the front door and locked it, not out of fear but out of habit. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was earned. Winter arrived gradually on Marigold Street, not with dramatic storms, but with subtle shifts. The mornings grew quieter, the light thinner, the air sharper against the windows. Eleanor Whitmore noticed everything. She had always noticed everything. The difference now was that she did not have to filter her awareness through someone else's moods. The house had settled. Fresh paint had fully dried, carrying only the faintest scent of renewal. The floors gleamed from weeks of steady care. The small apricot glow in the living room softened even the coldest afternoons, and Eleanor's armchair by the bay window once again felt like an anchor rather than a compromise. But the true transformation had not been architectural. It had been internal. In the months following Thomas's departure, something unexpected happened. The story did not end with eviction or divorce papers. It expanded. The Wednesday teas grew. At first, they were informal for women, then 6, then 9. Word traveled quietly. Someone's cousin from across town asked to attend. A retired school principal brought her neighbor. A widow in her late 70s arrived one afternoon clutching a folder so tightly her knuckles whitened. "My son wants me to refinance," she said without preamble, lowering herself carefully into a dining chair. "He says it's just paperwork. Temporary." Eleanor did not respond immediately.
She poured tea first.
Set down cups. Created calm before clarity. "What would refinancing accomplish?" she asked gently. "He says it would free up equity for his business." "And if the business fails?" The woman's eyes flickered. "He says it won't." Eleanor leaned back slightly. "Hope is not a financial plan." No one laughed. They nodded. Conversations like that became common. Eleanor never told anyone what to do. She did not issue commands or offer dramatic speeches. She offered questions. She explained processes. She described, in calm detail, the difference between a will and a deed, between temporary assistance and permanent transfer. She spoke about power of attorney, about co-signing risks, about the quiet ways older people are persuaded to give away leverage under the language of love. "Ownership," she would say, hands folded loosely in her lap, "is not selfishness. It is responsibility. And responsibility does not vanish because someone calls you mom." Melissa attended some of those gatherings. She did not sit at the head of the table. She did not speak often, but she listened with a focus that surprised even Eleanor. Divorce proceedings moved forward steadily. Thomas attempted reconciliation twice, once with anger, once with charm. Both attempts failed. Melissa had signed a 1-year lease on a slightly larger apartment closer to her office. She had created a budget spreadsheet. She tracked her expenses. She paid her own utilities. One evening after tea, as the last guest left and dusk settled outside, Melissa lingered. "Do you ever feel guilty?" she asked quietly. Eleanor rinsed 2 cups in the sink before answering.
No.
Melissa leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Not even a little?" "I feel sad that it took so long," Eleanor said. "But guilt would imply wrongdoing." Melissa stared at the kitchen tiles. "He keeps saying you broke the family." Eleanor turned off the faucet and faced her daughter fully. "Families do not break when truth is introduced," she said calmly. "They break when truth is avoided." Melissa absorbed that slowly. "You know," she said after a moment, If you had turned the card back on that first week, I would have come home. I would have convinced myself you were overreacting. I know, Eleanor replied. And you didn't.
No.
Melissa nodded once. Thank you. It was the closest thing to an apology either of them required. Spring approached, and with it came small practical changes. Eleanor replaced the worn front gate. She planted lavender along the walkway. She hired a carpenter to repair the nail holes in the old study, transforming it back into a reading room with shelves lined neatly with books she had boxed away years earlier. The house did not look drastically different from the outside, but inside, it breathed differently. One afternoon, as Eleanor sorted mail at the dining table, she found an envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. No return address. She opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter. Thomas had found temporary contract work in another city. He blamed circumstances. He blamed market shifts. He blamed misunderstandings. He did not apologize. But at the end, one sentence stood out. I underestimated you. Eleanor folded the letter once and placed it in a drawer. Underestimation had never been her weakness. Silence had. And silence no longer lived here. As the months passed, something subtle but powerful solidified in Eleanor's reputation within her circle. She became someone women called before signing documents, before adding names to titles, before temporarily sharing control. She did not seek that role. It found her. One Wednesday, a woman named Harriet arrived visibly shaken. Her daughter had presented paperwork that morning, requesting joint ownership for convenience. I don't want to seem distrustful, Harriet said, voice trembling. She says I'm being dramatic. Eleanor reached across the table and rested her hand lightly over Harriet's. Boundaries do not accuse, she said softly. They clarify. Harriet nodded, tears forming but not falling. That phrase traveled beyond the dining room. It appeared scribbled in notebooks, written on sticky notes, repeated in phone calls. Boundaries do not accuse. They clarify. Meanwhile, Melissa continued rebuilding her life. She enrolled in an evening certification program to strengthen her position at work. She reduced her expenses. She made new friends outside of Thomas's social circle. She did not ask her mother for money. Occasionally, she asked for advice, but never rescue. The shift between them was undeniable. They no longer related through dependency. They related through choice. One evening in late summer, nearly a year after Thomas had muted the television, Eleanor hosted a small dinner rather than tea. The table was set with simple linens and fresh flowers from her garden. Laughter filled the dining room, not loud or chaotic, but warm. After guests departed, Eleanor returned to her armchair by the bay window. She picked up the television remote again, turning it idly between her fingers.
Such a simple object.
Once weaponized, now irrelevant. She turned the television on briefly, watched the evening news headline scroll across the screen, then turned it off before the first segment ended. Silence settled comfortably around her. It was no longer heavy. It was chosen. The lesson that had taken her 71 years to articulate now lived clearly within her. Love without boundaries becomes entitlement. Assistance without limits becomes erasure. Silence in the face of disrespect is not peace. It is permission. She had once believed endurance proved devotion. Now she understood that clarity protects dignity. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. A soft breeze moved the lavender along the walkway. Inside, the apricot walls reflected lamplight gently. Eleanor Whitmore was not staying in her house. She was inhabiting it. And that difference had changed everything.